Montana Territory. Late autumn. 1878, the first snow had dusted the peaks of the Absaroka Range when someone knocked on the door of a man who had not spoken to another soul in near 3 years. Xavier Callahan had lived quiet on his land just outside of Livingston, tucked between the pines and the Yellowstone River. Folks in town called him the ghost rider, came to market once every season, spoke only to trade, and left with his hat low. He built his own house, raised his own cattle, and didn't owe a damn thing to anyone. So when the knock came firm, not desperate, but not casual either, Xavier stood still for a long moment, one hand on the rifle that rested by the door. He opened it slow. A woman stood there, wrapped in a worn wool shawl, face wind-burned and eyes steady. Her skirt was damp from creek water. Behind her, a buckboard wagon leaned sideways, stuck in the ditch, one wheel cracked. 2 children, a girl and a boy, both under 10, sat on the seat, curled up beneath a blanket. "I do not mean to intrude," she said, "but we have nowhere else to go." Xavier looked past her at the wagon, then back. She did not flinch under his stare. "Husband, dead," she said. "6 months ago, we were headed for Bozeman. The axle gave out. I saw smoke from your chimney." "Bozeman's 40 miles south," Xavier said. "I know," she said, "but we cannot walk it." He looked at the children. The girl met his gaze. The boy didn't move. The woman added, "My name is Prudence Clay. That's my daughter, Tessa. And my son, Tobias." Xavier stepped back from the door. "Get them inside." She didn't cry, didn't thank him either, just nodded once, turned, and called to the children. Tessa helped her brother down, and Prudence lifted him the rest of the way. The boy's leg was wrapped in a torn shirt. Xavier saw it was swollen. "He fell from the wagon a few days back," she said as she passed him. "I tried to splint it." Xavier closed the door behind them. The wind died as it latched shut. He stoked the fire and brought out a pot of stew from the hearth. They had eaten nothing warm in days. While the children devoured every bite, Prudence tore strips off her own dress to clean Tobias's leg. Xavier brought water, bandages, and left her to tend him. When the boy finally slept, Xavier said, "You can stay in the loft. It is warmer than the barn. Wagon will have to wait." "I did not ask for much," she said, not unkindly, "but I am grateful." He nodded once. She went to the children, curled beside them in the loft with the wool blanket he tossed up to her. Xavier didn't sleep much that night. He sat by the fire, listening to the wind scrape snow against the windows and the quiet breaths of the strangers above him. By morning, the snow had stopped, and the world outside was white and still. He stepped out to the barn before sunrise, cracked ice off the water trough, fed the horses. When he came back in, Prudence was already up, sleeves rolled, hands deep in his flour tin. She glanced over her shoulder. "I can cook," she said, "and I can help. You are giving us shelter. I will not sit idle." "I did not ask you to," Xavier said. "I know. But I will." By the end of the day, she had washed the dishes, swept the floor, and folded what little spare bedding he had. She didn't speak much, but when she looked at her children, something soft lit her face. Tessa followed Xavier out to the barn later that week. "Mama said not to bother you," she said, "but I want to help." He handed her a bucket. She carried water without complaint. Tobias stayed inside. His leg took a fever, and Prudence sat with him through the nights, wiping his brow, whispering stories he barely heard. Xavier watched her quiet. On the 4th day, he rode into town for supplies. When he came back, the boy was worse. "I think the break's gone bad," Prudence said. "He needs more than I know how to give." Xavier looked at the boy, then he looked at her. "Can he ride?" "Not on his own." Xavier nodded. "Then I will take him." They left at dawn, Prudence riding beside Xavier while Tobias dozed against her chest. It took half a day to reach the town doctor in Livingston. The man reset the leg properly, gave them salve and instructions. "You brought him just in time," the doctor said. Another few days and that leg would have gone. Xavier glanced at Prudence. She was holding Tobias's hand, eyes wet, jaw tight. They stayed in town that night. Xavier paid for a room with 2 beds. He took the one by the window. Prudence looked at him after the children fell asleep. "Why did you help us?" Xavier stared out at the street below. "Because you asked." "That's simple," he looked at her. "Nothing simple, but yes." Silence stretched between them. It was not uncomfortable. When they returned to the cabin, the snow had melted enough to see the ground again. Life found a rhythm. Xavier repaired the wagon. Prudence planted herbs outside the kitchen window. Tessa learned to milk the goat, and Tobias, though still limping, followed Xavier around the pasture with questions. 2 weeks passed. Then 4. One morning Xavier came in from the field, boots muddy and shirt damp with sweat. Prudence was at the table mending a tear in Tobias's coat. She looked up. "You are always alone," she said. "I prefer it that way." "Do you still?" He didn't answer at first. Then he said, "Not as much as I used to." She stood. "I am not asking for a promise, I know. But I do not want to leave." He stepped closer. "I do not want you to." She reached for his hand, calloused fingers brushing his. That night she kissed him by the fire. It was not rushed. It was not hesitant either. It was a quiet, certain thing. And Xavier, who had kept to himself for years, did not pull away. The first hard frost came the morning Prudence lifted a kettle off the hearth and found her breath clouding in the air. Xavier had gone out before sunrise, same as every day, and she could hear the muted rhythm of the axe behind the cabin. She poured water into a basin and set it near the fire to warm. Tessa stirred from the cot in the corner, rubbing her eyes. "Is it still snowing?" the girl asked. "Not today," Prudence said, brushing hair from her daughter's face. "But it's coming." She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside. The forest was quiet, the branches rimed with frost. Xavier stood a few yards from the shed, sleeves rolled, arms swinging steady. He paused when he saw her. "Winter's rough up here," he said, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "Won't be much easy come January." "We'll make it through," she said. He nodded once, then turned back to the woodpile. That evening Prudence brought down a small tin from the loft. Inside were a few scraps of cloth, a pair of scissors, and a spool of thread so thin it trembled between her fingers. She sat near the firelight, eyes narrowed as she stitched. Xavier sat across from her, sharpening a blade with slow, even passes along the stone. "What are you making?" he asked. "A coat for Tobias. His old one's too short through the arms. You've got a way with your hands. My mother taught me. She'd sew by lantern light when I was Tessa's age. Said if your stitches hold, your house won't fall." Xavier looked up from the blade. "You ever think about leaving Montana?" She didn't answer right away. The needle paused mid-air. "Sometimes. There are days I miss the sound of bells from home, Virginia bells, ringing clear through trees that don't lose their green. But even if I turned back now, it wouldn't be the place I left." She tied off the thread, smoothed the cloth flat. "I think I was meant to come west," she said quietly. Tessa was asleep by the hearth, curled tight under the quilt. Tobias, his legs still stiff, lay beside her, his breathing soft and even. Xavier set the knife down. "I never asked what your husband did," he said. She looked at him. "He was a tinsmith," she said. "Good with his hands, not so good with direction. He wanted to start fresh. Thought a claim near Bozeman would change our fortunes. You followed him." "I did." She didn't say more. She didn't need to. Later that week, Xavier led Tobias outside, guiding him with a hand under his elbow. They walked slow along the edge of the clearing, the boy leaning heavier on his good leg. Prudence watched from the porch, arms folded. "You should let him try the mare," Xavier said. "He's still healing." He don't need to ride. Just to sit up there, feel the saddle under him. Might remind him he's not broken. She hesitated, then nodded once. That afternoon, Xavier lifted Tobias onto the horse's back and held the reins while the boy sat tall, eyes wide. Tessa clapped her hands from the fence post. Prudence stood nearby, silent, but her hand crept to her heart. That night as they sat near the fire, she said, "You've got away with him." Xavier shrugged. "I was a quiet boy, too, didn't talk much till I was near grown. What changed that? I met someone who didn't need me to talk much." She tilted her head. "And did you love her?" "I did," he said. "She died in Texas from the fever, long time ago." Prudence didn't look away. "Grief changes people." "It does." Neither spoke for a while. The fire cracked low. "I think," she said finally, "we're both still learning how to live again." His eyes found hers. "Feels like we're doing it together." She reached across the space between them, her fingers finding his. There was no rush in the way their hands folded, only understanding. Out in the dark, the wind moved gentle through the tall grass, and from the loft above, the slow breath of sleeping children kept measure with the quiet beat of something new, something steady. The first full thaw didn't come until the middle of March. The river broke open in slow fits, ice heaving and cracking through its own skin, until water ran clear again past the cottonwoods. Morning sun hit the hills earlier now, and the days stretched longer, though the nights still clung to cold. Xavier came in from the shed carrying a rusted brace and bit he'd found tangled in a coil of harness. He set it down and nodded toward the boy, who sat with a slate across his lap, tongue caught between his teeth as he copied letters. "He's near got the whole alphabet now," Xavier said. Prudence looked up from where she was mashing dried rosehips with a pestle. "He'll want to keep at it. Once he's up and walking fully, he'll need more than chores to occupy him. He's stubborn like someone else I know." She didn't smile, but the corner of her mouth curved faintly. She tapped the paste into a small jar and reached for a strip of waxed linen to seal it. "I was thinking," she said, "we'll need to plant sooner than later. I saw a patch near the south fence that gets full sun." Xavier leaned against the doorframe and crossed his arms. "That soil's rocky. You'll have to dig deep." "I've dug deeper in worse ground." He watched her twist the jar closed, fingers quick and practiced. "You've got plans." "I do." She looked up at him. "But not ones that carry us anywhere else." Tessa burst in before either could speak again, cheeks red from the wind, boots muddy. "There's someone coming down the trail. I seen dust from the ridge." Prudence stood, brushing crumbs of rosehip from her apron. "You recognize the horse?" Tessa shook her head. "It's a wagon, covered." Xavier stepped outside. By the time the wagon reached the gate, he'd already saddled his own horse and stood with the reins in hand. The rider was a man near 50, with a trimmed beard and a stovepipe hat that didn't suit the trail mud clinging to his coat. He stopped the mule team and tipped his head, looking for a woman traveling with children. Widow Clay. Heard she might have passed this way. Prudence stepped out beside Xavier, hands still damp from the pestle work. "Who's asking?" "Name's Harlan Quinn. I'm a circuit judge out of Helena. Your husband left a claim dispute open," he said. "Your name was on the deed." Prudence set her jaw. "That land was never staked right. We were misled." "I believe you," Quinn replied, "but it's been settled now. The other party folded. There's a purse and deed that's rightfully yours." Xavier glanced toward her but said nothing. Quinn reached into the wagon and pulled out a canvas parcel. "You'll want to sign receipt. I'm headed to Bozeman next. Thought I'd save you the travel." She took the papers, eyes scanning the page slowly, lips pressed thin. "Thank you. I'll be on my way then." They watched him turn the wagon, and when the dust settled again, Prudence held the parcel without speaking. Inside, Xavier poured water into the basin. How much is it? Enough that we could buy a full claim in Bozeman. Build from scratch. New start. You want to go? She looked at him across the table. I wanted something better for my children. That was always the goal, but better isn't a place. It's what they wake up to. Xavier didn't move, but his voice came low. You think they'd be better off here? I think they already are. She stepped around the table and laid the papers beside the hearth. We have what we need here. And what we didn't, we've been building. He nodded once, his hand brushing hers as they turned toward the stove. Later that week, she cleared out the lean-to behind the barn and turned it into a root cellar. Tessa helped her line it with dried moss and stone. Tobias limped less now, and Xavier took him to the meadow to gather fence posts stripped bare by wind. One evening, after the children had gone to sleep, Xavier found her sitting outside with a cup of warm cider in her hands, steam curling against the starlight. I never asked what you dreamed of before Montana, he said. She didn't answer at first. Then softly, a kitchen with herbs hanging from the beams, children with full bellies, a man who came home at the end of the day and looked at me like I was not a burden but a comfort. Xavier sat beside her, their shoulders touching. And now, I have a kitchen. My children laugh again. And the man I share this fire with meets my eyes without looking past me. He turned to face her. I don't intend to go anywhere, I know. They didn't kiss then. They didn't need to. The quiet between them had grown full enough to carry meaning. The next morning, Prudence stepped into the field with her sleeves rolled and a spade in her hand. Xavier joined her without a word. They broke ground together, side by side, while the children played beneath the thawing trees. By early April, the wind turned warmer and carried the scent of wet bark and thawed earth. The riverbank softened, and the ground gave underfoot with each step. Prudence stood at the edge of the pasture, sleeves damp to the elbow, pulling early shoots of sorrel from the fence line for cooking. She wiped her brow with the back of her wrist and turned when she heard Xavier's boots crunch behind her. There's an old plow in the lean-to, he said. Needs a new handle, but the blade's still sharp. She brushed dirt from her hands. We'll need it if we're planting more than what fits in the yard. I'll cut a handle from that ash tree near the ridge. It's dense enough. She nodded, then looked up at the sky. I don't remember the last spring I saw without dread. Xavier stepped beside her. You see this one different, I do. He didn't ask why. He didn't have to. Later that week, 2 riders came up the trail. Xavier saw them before they reached the lower gate, 1 man, 1 woman, both mounted, saddlebags heavy with dust. They dismounted slow and waited outside the fence. Marshall Hodge, the man said, tipping his hat. Out of Gallatin. This here's Miss Ruth Denning, she keeps the post records. Xavier kept his stance easy, but his eyes stayed sharp. What brings you? There's a man out of Missouri come through Bozeman last week asking after a widow with 2 children. Claims he's kin, said he was owed. He gave her name. Xavier turned slightly, just enough to glance toward the cabin. Prudence was inside, the door closed. He returned his gaze to the marshal. He gave his own name, said he was Clay, brother to the deceased. Ruth spoke next, her voice more clipped. He wasn't lying about the relation, but he wasn't after family. He was asking what rights she had to her husband's possessions. Xavier's jaw shifted once. She's got the deed, settled legal. No dispute there, Ruth said, but men like him don't need law to stir trouble. He's headed north. Xavier's voice came low. He come here, he'll find a gate that don't open. The marshal nodded. That's all we needed to hear. They left without stepping past the fence line. By evening, Prudence had heard the full of it. She stood by the kitchen table, arms folded, her expression unreadable. He was bitter when my husband left Missouri, she said. Thought he deserved a portion of whatever we built, but we built nothing together. You want me to ride out, set it straight? No, her gaze didn't waver. If he comes, I'll face him. But not alone. You won't be. She reached for the lamp and lit it, flame rising steady. Then I won't worry. The following days passed without sign of trouble. Tobias helped Xavier finish the handle for the plow, his limp easing now to a faint drag. Tessa gathered moss from the riverbank for the garden beds. Prudence spent her mornings in the field, her skirts tucked high and her hands dark with soil. One evening, as dusk settled blue over the trees, Xavier returned from the ridge carrying a brace of quail. He found her sitting just outside the cabin, a letter open in her lap. "You get word?" he asked. She looked up. "A cousin from back east. She'd heard we'd come west, wants to know if we're alive." "You'll write back." "I think I will." He crouched beside her, setting the birds aside. "You ever miss it, Virginia?" She folded the letter. "No, I miss what I thought it might still be, but that's different." He rested a hand against her knee, his fingers warm through the fabric. "You ever think this place could be home?" She turned toward him, her voice low, certain. "It already is." The following morning, Xavier hitched the mare to the plow and Prudence walked beside him, guiding the blade through the soft earth. They didn't speak much, but shared glances, gestures, a rhythm that needed no words. Tessa brought them water in a tin pail, her hands red from the cold. Tobias sat with a book open in his lap, tracing the lines with his finger, lips moving. That night, as the fire settled low and the cabin grew quiet, Prudence stepped from the loft and crossed to where Xavier sat, mending a cracked stirrup. She knelt beside him and rested her hand on his shoulder. "I think we could build more than a season here." He looked at her, eyes steady. "We already are." Then she leaned in, her forehead against his, breath shared in the hush. There was no question in it, no hesitation, just a promise, quiet and whole. The first sprouts broke through the soil in late April, thin green threads, reaching up between rows of loam. Xavier and Prudence had carved together. Tessa kept count of each seedling as though they were family, and Tobias had taken to scratching small marks in a plank nailed to the porch post, marking how long it had been since his legs stopped aching. The days moved with rhythm now. Not fast, not slow. Just steady, like the pulse of things that had settled into their right shape. One morning, Prudence carried a bucket down to the creek, hem of her skirt lifted above the dew-wet grass. The current was strong from the melt, and when she dipped the tin in, her reflection wavered under the surface, older than the girl who'd crossed the Mississippi, but steadier, her eyes lined with more purpose than wear. As she stood, a low whistle came from the trees, followed by the soft crunch of moss under boots. Xavier stepped out from the shade, a canvas sack slung over one shoulder. "Found a rusted saw blade out past the ridge," he said. "Might be worth grinding down." She nodded, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "If you've still got that file in the shed, I can take the edge off it." He looked at her a long moment before speaking again. "You ever think you'd be doing things like this alone? Raising children, patching tools, planting rows to feed through winter. I used to believe my life would follow someone else's track. I thought I'd be led, not leading." She dipped the bucket again. "But the world shook that notion loose." "You lead quiet," he said, "but sure." She met his eyes. "And you follow without needing to take the reins." That night, the children stayed in the loft with a candle and a book of folk stories Tessa had taken a liking to. Prudence stepped out onto the porch after supper, pulling her shawl close. Xavier joined her, a mug of warm milk between his hands. "I've been thinking about the land," he said, not looking at her. "It's more than I can work alone." She kept her gaze on the trees. "You're not alone." "No," he said. "But I want it set right. I want your name on the deed beside mine." Not because of the boy's kin sniffing around or what some lawman says, because it's yours now as much as mine." She turned to face him. "You certain?" "I haven't been unsure of you in months." They sat in silence for a while, not out of lack but out of peace. The kind of peace that didn't need to be spoken to be understood. 2 weeks later, they rode into Livingston again. The same clerk who'd drawn up the first deed scratched his head when Xavier asked for a new one. "You sure?" he asked, glancing between them. Xavier only said, "I don't repeat myself." The papers were drawn, signed, and sealed. When they stepped back outside, the sun was high and clean in the sky. Prudence took Xavier's hand in full view of the street. He didn't pull away. That summer the garden grew fat and green. Tobias walked without favoring his leg. Tessa learned to sew a hem that held. The cabin's walls were lined with dried lavender and willow bark. A second bed was built, not for guests, but because the loft now belonged to the children alone. One night in July, under a sky so wide it nearly swallowed the hills, Xavier took something from his pocket, an iron ring, shaped by his own hand in the shed. He didn't kneel. He didn't ask. He just held it out and said, "You've made this place home. Let me make it yours in name." Prudence closed her fingers over it, eyes bright. "It already is." They married in the field, with the children standing close and no preacher but the wind. Tessa held a bouquet of sage and chamomile. Tobias wore his best shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow. Xavier pressed his lips to Prudence's forehead, and she leaned into him as though she'd belonged nowhere else. Years passed. Seasons turned. The scars of old years faded into the texture of daily life. Tessa grew into a young woman who could read Latin and shoot a squirrel from 30 paces. Tobias helped Xavier build a second barn, his limp all but gone. Prudence taught women from the outlying farms how to plant by moon's cycle and mend without waste. She kept her shawl by the door, though she rarely needed it. Xavier aged quiet, the lines around his eyes deepening, his hands remaining steady. He rose before dawn every morning, and never once failed to leave a cup of warm milk at the bedside before he stepped outside. And every evening, Prudence met him at the porch, her hand slipping into his without a word. They lived without fanfare, without noise, but with a deep, steady joy that belonged to people who had seen the worst and still chosen to build. Together, they watched the horizon stay golden long after the sun dipped down, and in that light they lived every day of their love earned, quiet, and whole.